All right, Chapter 5, Cultural Approaches. In the 1990s, the idea of using culture as a metaphor for organizational communication was quite a fad. And it sort of took a lot of things, both secular and in academia, by storm. It certainly became the new theme. This chapter is going to explore some of those initial approaches, which are called the prescriptive approaches to studying culture. And we'll look at two examples of that, and then explore some alternative approaches, what cultural scholars specifically would do, and then some approaches. So that sort of gives you an idea of where the chapter is going. So again, in detail, this is sort of your outline for the chapter. So specifically, looking at everything regarding organizational communication and the prescriptive, the alternative, an example of an alternative, and then the methods is the fundamental focus of this particular chapter. So let's dive into the first one, which more or less is the idea of where we have been, the prescriptive or early approaches to looking at culture. Here we have two major books that hit the market, one by Deal and Kennedy, the book called Strong Cultures, and the other Peters and Waterman's Excellent Culture. Now, Deal and Kennedy's, they came up with the notion that there were four components to any strong culture, and those four components are listed there. Values, heroes, rites, rituals, and a cultural network. In Peters and Waterman's work, Excellent Culture, this was looking at specific themes that were, indicative, or think of a theme or a goal or a value system that were indicative of organizational culture. So now in terms of academia, a lot of current, or a lot of researchers at the time, organizational communication scholars, were not very thrilled with these. They didn't embrace these books. They thought that they were more prescriptive of what managers ought to do rather than accurate descriptions of really what was going on. And so while it was interesting, I thought it was a bit naive to assume that there was a single formula that was applicable to everybody. And it treated culture as a thing, something that an organization has, not something that an organization is. And so a lot of academia had some problems with these early prescriptive approaches to looking at culture. But however, it did get sort of the creative juices flowing, and a lot of alternative approaches by cultural scholars began to be developed. And there were a lot of distinctions between those prescriptive approaches and the ones taken by the cultural scholars. Predominantly, those four approaches are listed here. The idea that that an organizational culture is complicated means that there are a lot of different markers or things that you can use to investigate culture. You can study rites, you can study ceremonies, you can study values, belief systems, how people talk, different things that occur around the water cooler in the office. All of those things can be studied in examining an organizational culture. So therefore, culture is complicated. The idea that culture is emergent simply is to say that that culture is growing. It's not. It's a process. It's not complete. It's not finished. It's not finalized. It's not a product you analyze. It's a process. It's socially created, and it's a performance in a sense. There are many different variables of that. When we say that communication or organizational cultures are not unitary, that means there's not a single culture. I mean, you can obviously have a sort of a subculture of the mailroom clerks, and then there's the other culture of the vice presidents and the CEOs, and there's a variety of different subcultures that exist within an organization, and some inconsistencies between those, and that should be expected. You don't want the same culture exactly in every single aspect of the organization, and so there's different different aspects of it, and so therefore it is definitely ambiguous. It's hard to interpret sometimes. You can be looking at one aspect of the culture and think you have a grasp of the entire thing, when actually your perception is a bit skewed. Now, in terms of looking at a specific example, Shine's model of organizational culture, Shine was a management scholar. He was interested specifically in looking at leadership, and he defined culture with a couple of unique characteristics. He said culture is group. Culture has a pattern of assumptions that go together. It is emergent, it's growing, and it's very much this idea of socialization. Now, in his particular model that he created or developed and wrote about, he said there are three levels to this. First level one is an artifact. An artifact are the things that are indicative of an organization. Perhaps it's the motto, perhaps it's the logo, perhaps it's the building in which the communication occurs. There's a lot of different things that make up organizational culture. In terms of espoused values, those are what a culture's credo is, the things that it says it believes in. Now notice espouse, that means not necessarily put into practice, followed up on, and behaved upon, but what their credo is, what it is they say that they believe. And a lot of basic assumptions, and that has a lot to do with norms and roles and along those lines. There is a model, by the way, that you'll see, this idea, this onion model, and that's in the textbook. The last big aspect that I want to talk about here is this methods of studying organizational communication or organizational culture. And it's important to understand that these are very much qualitative in nature. The idea of an ethnography, that you enter this particular culture and you sort of become one of the members of that particular culture, and you analyze it from within. And then from that unique position of embedded within the culture, you develop what is called grounded theory. In other words, it's a theory developed with deeply interrelated according to the circumstances around you. Rather than externally apply, it's internally driven. Very interesting research with ethnographic research on a variety of different dimensions. Organizationally is just one. And then once you have this grounded theory, how do you communicate that? And the idea that communication scholars communicate the results of an ethnographic grounded theory through what are called cultural tales. And your book goes into that. And in a nutshell, it was a little bit longer than what I thought I could do it in 5 minutes, and I think it's been about 8. But nonetheless, there you have the nuts and bolts of Chapter 5. Obviously, go to the textbook for some specific details. That gives you a little idea.